when Jehovah's Witnesses come up to me on the street, I don't think they tell me I'm going to hell. I think that they give messages of love, messages of forgiveness. I think that they have incentives to seem as broad and as friendly and as open and as welcome as possible. I think that if I wasn't religious and wasn't exposed to ideas of heaven and hell, and that wasn't an existing belief system that I bought into, someone I never met telling me that I was going to burn in eternity sounds like an implausible claim. I think opening government have mischaracterised the way in which this proselytisation works, which takes out the vast majority of their principal thing. Two other things. Firstly, I also think they misunderstand the fact that this is often majority proselytisation. It seems to me that if you are the majority of religions, you have less people to persuade, and therefore will be less likely to take this as a tactic. Thirdly, just to the last minute of their speech about religious political parties, it's unclear if they are properly banning religious parties, because we think your identity should make up part of your political view. We don't really understand where that fits into the debate, given they're still going to be religious in the public sphere. Three things in this speech. Firstly, the particular incentives that these religious proselytisers have. Secondly, who we think proselytise and how we think this helps minority groups. And thirdly, a little bit about free speech and why this is justified. Firstly, what incentives do you have? We just don't think that they're as confrontational as they propose. Three reasons for this. Firstly, all the stuff in my introduction about how you don't want to be seen as exclusive, about how you're unlikely to believe something if this is the first time you've heard it, about the idea. And secondly, who are they talking about, right? Because we do think that they proselytise the sorts of people who need support in their lives. We think they proselytise the sort of people who need the idea of an other, the idea of support. We think they proselytise people who've made mistakes and they want forgiveness. We think they're far more likely to go up to people, given everyone has made mistakes in their lives and everyone feels guilty about something, with a message of it's okay, God still loves you, you can work to relieve your sins, you can work to become a better person, because that's just a message that people are much more likely to attach onto than going and publicly shaming people. Because I've never found publicly shaming people a particularly effective method of getting them to like me. Second thing, this idea that they prey on fear. The problem with them preying on fear is that we just don't think that's exclusive to religious groups, right? We think that every single time there is an anti-immigrant rally, that is something that preys on people's inability to understand that. We think every single time there is a rally about a form of international relations, that's because there is a country that has been demonised in the public perception. We don't think the idea that you prey on fear is a sufficient justification for removing these people. We think you just have an incentive to be friendly. We think you have an incentive to provide leaflets that tell you it's going to be okay. Even if this is not every case, we think that this is sufficient for it to be most cases, or at least a sufficiently large number of cases, that the fact that that was the premise of their argument means that it does not stand. And what are the benefits of this? Firstly, we say that person-to-person interactions are exceptionally important in shutting down people's narrative of you. We think that a vast majority of people in the Western world are Islamophobic. People in the Muslim world often fear Christians because they are an other, they are an unknown. Even if they know people of that specific religion, it's rare that they have conversations about what that religion means to them. If I am someone who's approached by an Islamic person who tells me what that religion means to me, gives me quite good messages of that religion, tries to at least, by very definition, portray that religion in a positive light, I am less likely to be Islamophobic afterwards. I am less likely to listen to the generalizations and the characterizations of that religion that I've gone through the media, because we think it should be a premise in this debate that you are more likely to portray your religion positively than your average observer, especially if that observer is so hatred. And it's that person-to-person narrative, which is also incredibly meaningful in other ways. Firstly, we say that the sorts of people who convert to religion should be able to have that opportunity to convert to religion, right? Two reasons for this. Firstly, some people find enormous comfort from the idea that there is an other, from the idea that they are supported, from the idea that they are loved. They are often people who are vulnerable, who have gone through terrible times, and we would like to give them that support. We say that you get a community. You say that you get person-to-person interaction. You say that you just get someone listening to you and give you an option of how you want to be okay. The fact that it helps that person so much, it makes it a sufficiently good thing. I'll take closing.
So under the status quo, we ban public nudity. Why do you believe this is the case?
I didn't hear that, sorry.
Under the status quo, we ban being nude in public. Why do you believe this is the case?
Okay. I think being nude is something that we think is highly likely to offend, very likely to offend people and be intelligibly indecent. I don't think we allow, I don't think the restrictions on banning nudity are as important in a place where there are large amounts of adults, and I think that depends on the extent to which there are children there, the extent to you can't moderate your discussion with nudity, you can't make it context specific. That's not something that these religious people can do. They can moderate the tone of their discussion. And lastly, this idea that we think minority religions will proselytize all the time. What's the problem now? You push them into a private sphere, right? You make it harder for them to be in public. You make it harder for them to have interaction with majority religions. You make it harder for that understanding to have. We say that actually it's not neutral. We say that the state is never viewed as a neutral actor. Because if this happened in Western Europe, the state will be viewed as a Christian state. Even if they stop Jehovah's Witnesses proselytizing, there is still a history of religion in that state. We say the vast majority of states have a type of religion that is opposed to it. That means that it will still be looked by the minority religions as something the majority is imposing on them. A couple of problems with this. We just think that there's increasing distrust amongst minority religion communities, that they are not accepted, right? This is what happened when you banned the burqa in France. Muslims in France feel like the state is persecuting them, and they feel like that is not okay. We say that they change their narrative when they're talking to people, because if I only have a limited time to proselytize, and I'm going to proselytize anyway, and I can't go out on the street and do it, I'm much more likely to spend time in my Sunday church, or to spend time in my madrasa, and my arguments to those people are probably going to get more intense. They're probably going to mean that more people in that religion are exposed to ideas which are more radical, which shut people out more. We say that you have the narrative of people that the state hates you. This is a special problem given there's less oversight, right? The US was able to punish people, put people in jail, because they preached very radical things openly. It's much harder to engage with them. It's much harder to see that extremism in madrasas if they're only in private spheres. Right? We say that it's problematic for religions if they have such different outlooks in both public and private spheres, so we at very least act as a moderating factor, because the rest of the society can keep them in check. Lastly, on free speech. We believe that your religion is part of your identity, especially if it's true that your religion tells you you need to proselytize in order to be a good person. You're not suddenly going to get rid of the fact Jehovah's Witnesses think that this is something that they need to do to get into heaven. You're not going to get rid of the fact that they think that this is part of their identity, part of what drives them forward, part of what makes them achieve a good life. We think it is illegitimate for the states to deny that part of your identity for what we think is very little benefit and a hell of a lot of harms. We beg you to oppose.
I would like to thank you very much for that speech, and I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case of the proposition.
The Business Insider recently published a report showing what the Al-Qaeda recruitment manual looked like. One of the first things it said was, be nice to them. But that doesn't make it a good thing, right? It's still exclusive, it's still hate-based. You can still be nice, but preach hatred to people in public. Yeah. So I'll talk about a few things in this debate. And just to be abundantly clear in this debate, I think Mayor from the very get-go clearly laid out, yes, we are banning religious political parties. Yes, we are banning political advocacy that advocates for religion. And I think that is what the motion demands, because that is literally advocating for a religion when the religious party stands up to fight for those rights, right? Now, a few things in this debate. First, I'll talk about why is it that preaching in itself is necessarily harmful on a absent via context. Number two, I'll talk about what happens when majorities dominate within these kinds of discussions, and the discussions that they want to talk about doesn't happen. Third, I'll talk about religion-based politics, why we think that's really terrible. Fourth, I'll talk about why private interpretation leads to better outcomes. And fifth, I'll talk about why this leads to better moderation within religions. Those things might sometimes overlap. I apologize if my structure is not the best. So first, in terms of how this works, right? I think, yes, we did not disagree with them that they have an incentive to be nice, but it doesn't take away from the fact that it's still exclusive. It still preaches some form of a hatred of, or at least otherization of others. And I think that necessarily means that you don't have that, right? At least in the private sphere, people have the ability to reach out for themselves. And that, by the way, like a lot of opposition's arguments is literally people need help and people need support structures. We're not banning religion. If you need support structures, you can reach out to those communities in private spheres. That's fine, right? So the alternative, however, is this, right? So the difference is you are also at the same time playing on people's insecurity in those kinds of places. Even in your best case scenario, that's something being played on because the very people you describe are very vulnerable, are also therefore most susceptible to exploitation on that front. So we think that's particularly bad. Now we understand for some religions like advocacy is a fundamental tenet of their faith. However, a lot of things that are fundamental tenets of faith often change and often change over time when religions are not able to do something. So for example, right, for example, satya burning like in India was a really great thing for Hindus, but eventually it doesn't become a thing when states step in and ban it because they think it leads to bad social outcomes. Eventually those people are able to find meaning in other things that they can do through religion because religion can be open to interpretation. They can find other things that religion often does provide meaning for people, right? But the second thing is this, right? So let's talk about the fact that a lot of the discussion they talked about doesn't necessarily happen because majorities dominate, meaning minorities feel intimidated enough not to be able to therefore engage in the way opening opposition would like them to engage in. And all of the things they talk about, that culture is still dominated by the majority, literally happens because political advocacy happens through religion, right? The reason why a lot of these things happen, or Christianity is given importance, is because politicians come up and advocate for Christianity to be part of state structures. That's why, for example, even in your best case scenario, the subtle things, the necessity to go ahead and solemnly swear on a Bible before you take up juridity are subtle ways in which we alienate minorities, atheists, etc. So we would like to think that even in the best case scenario, there are subtle ways in which religious advocacy through political structures and majority structures seeps itself into cultures that effectively otherizes people. That's terrible. So moving on. So the point at which you can't do that public advocacy means there's less likelihood of that majority religion seeping into the culture to begin with. The next thing that I inserting itself in the culture. Okay, second. So what happens? No, thank you. So what happens when religious-based politics takes over? So I think that this debate doesn't happen in the best-case scenario of the developed world only, right? A lot of things happen. Even in the developed world, I think religion-based politics often diverts discussion away from the core issues. So for example, when you can give excuses such as, I don't like this because God doesn't believe in this, means that you are you can deflect accountability and divert yourself away from discussions that are necessary before you make policy-based discussions. We think that's bad, right? For example, abortion discussions, before the slavery discussions primarily about religion said this instead of actual reasons why you would do something, means that often politicians are also able to deflect accountability. Now, not only does this divert away from discussion, in more developing contexts, it often means that this is used as a tool to cling on to power for a lot of political structures. So for example, the Iranian structure in which the point at which the point at which you question authority means you're questioning God, means you're guilt-tripped into accepting government oppression, right? The ways in which the issues fatwas, saying that fatwas are religious preachings in Islam, saying that you can't go ahead and protest because protesting is haram, which is banned in Islam, means that you can't do all of these things. When the state uses religion to be able to commit oppression on people. Now, opening opposition says other forms of hate-based things can also be used. True, but we remove one of the evil ways in which this can be done. But number two, we will also point out that this is literally one of the fewer things that you cannot question authority on. Even if you do it based on race, people can question that authority as opposed to religion. That's why it's particularly harmful. Before I move on, disclosing, have anything?
So I know you have a problem with all those insipid ways where it seeps into culture, but this debate requires you to ban things from the world that exists right now and not reimagine the world. So can you please tell us, why can't the same governments use religion silently without actually stating that they're using religion as a status quo?
Look, here's the thing, right? A, yes, that exists in the world, but that thing might slowly become worse, the point at which religious advocacy becomes a public discussion. You can't say they will silently, secretly do things and nobody will... Right? Because the point at which, because it is get normalized in your world is the reason why they keep doing it and nobody questions it. That's what we change, right? Because it can't get normalized discussion because you just can't do it in public. Next, right? So what we would like to see here is this. Why is a private interpretation much, oh, by the way, like in a developing context, often like it's literally sometimes lead to genocides. I just to point that out when like hate-based politics becomes really, really bad. Like, yeah, she has something conflict, all that. Next, what I would like to say is that private interpretation is better. Yes, opening opposition is correct. This might be used as rhetoric by some people. However, that rhetoric also gets used currently when they say majorities dominate. They intimidate you from coming up. All that rhetoric still exists in opposition's world. The difference is private interpretation is better for a bunch of reasons. Because private interpretation means you are less likely to be able to have whole radical views when others in public space don't validate those views because you think, this is odd, I probably shouldn't be having these views. But the point at which other people start validating your radical views is the point at which people are more likely to be radical under your side. We remove that agency for them. But also, secondly, I would also like to point out that Salafis, for example, like mosques, madrasas they talked about, actually the vast majority of cases don't allow terrorists in. They use public places to have, for example, like Salafis will go around in UK putting pamphlets out for people to go through online links for them. Public places are the methods they often use to entice people to come in but the Muslim community has banned them from madrasas and mosques to begin with. So terrorism happens actually a lot more under your world. But just finally, right, I think evangelists are more likely to control because they have more funding, more resources. That means you lead to a more radical world, the world of Zakir Naik that tells people not to use contraception and all the harmful effects associated with it. Supremely proud to propose.
I would very much like to thank that speaker for that speech, and I would like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue the case to the opposition. Hear, hear.
I'm confused. This debate is not, this House prefers a secular world. This debate is about banning religious advocacy in public places. In these public places where people are already religious, where people already hold religious opinions, and where they are likely to interact with these opinions based on their previous experiences. It's a world where people aren't just going to have zero reaction to the kind of government policy that they want to implement. It's a world where people who have the kind of strong, deep-seated beliefs that they think are so important are certainly going to have opinions of some kind about this. And on opening opposition, we tell you that they're the kind of opinions that make this policy certainly worse than the status quo. A few things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to speak to you about religion as a form of oppression, whether or not we think this is something that is justified in limiting free speech and the dignity of individuals to express and interact with people of different religions. Secondly, I'm going to look at moderation and the kind of interactions and reactions that this policy would have, and why we think that fundamentally it fails in the way that it pushes people to the margins, making them more extremist and less likely to integrate. Firstly, I think it's important for us to recognize that we live in a world where historically different states have certain majority religions. These majority religions have very often had trickle-down effects into the cultures that those people have. So when they stand up and say that in America you need to swear on the Bible, this is despite the fact that America is a secular society. It is because of the fact that there are certain dominant Christian narratives that continue to exist. These narratives will still exist even with a ban on on advocacy in public spaces. All that we think that they do is they minimize the ability of minority religions to interact with these majority religions and have some kind of discussion that is actually meaningful. We think that what they do is they marginalize the people who are already marginalized, and in doing this only make things worse for them. We tell you, first, people are still going to be religious. Politicians are still going to be religious. They're still going to try and enact legislation, whether it's about like women's bodies or whatever else, based on those religious beliefs. Secondly, we tell you that very often the kinds of policies that they enact will be more likely to be targeting things like stuff that happens in your private life. Why? Because we've now pushed religion very specifically into the private domain. We think that it's really harmful when you change, like when you simply ban something in public without recognizing the way that that changes how people interact with it in the private spheres. Hannah tells you very specifically that what this does is it means that you're far more likely as a religious community to be far more extreme in your internal teachings. Whether because you have, I'll take a clarification, sure.
I'm confused because on one hand you say that we make no difference whatsoever because you can do it anyways, but on the other hand you're like, oh, but so much harms will happen out of our policy.
No,
which is
so I'm not saying that nothing happens. I'm saying that dominant religions exist at the moment and there are minority religions. When you do this, those minority religions become only more marginalized, and in becoming more marginalized because they feel the harms far more because like the majority religions continue to be powerful and majoritarian, we think that this leads to harms that Hannah spoke to you about and you didn't rebut. So let's talk about why we think that this specifically happens in the way that religion is seen as oppressive. They stand up and say religion preaches hate. They say that it's the kind of thing that even if you're perhaps saying you should be nice to people, is still exclusionary. We think that things that are perhaps exclusionary are still the kinds of things that we want in public domain for public discussions. That's why we allow people with differing political ideologies to stand up and have conversations, because it's important to understand how people who have different beliefs are able to interact and come to some kind of compromise. If we're living in a world where we have different people of different religions who have to live their day-to-day lives with one another, it's extremely important for us to allow those kinds of interactions and conversations to take place. We think that them happening in a public space where people can publicly access them is an important aspect. Secondly, they tell us that moderation happens better here because it happens internally. We tell you that in order for religions to become any more moderate or whatever else they want, it is important for them to understand the way that that religion interacts with everyday public life. We think that's why when the Pope realized that there was a public health crisis, he was more likely to allow things like the use of condoms. It's because in order for a religion to stay relevant to its people, it has to understand how those people interact with the rest of society. We also just ask to you, is a religion more or less likely to moderate when the only voices that get to contribute to that discussion are voices that come particularly from within that set of beliefs? It is far more likely that when people can bring in divergent ideas, that individuals will stand up and question that because they feel like at least externally they have some kind of power and support in order to advocate for that. Moreover, we just say that when the state says that religion is not something that they are willing to have as a discussion in the public sphere, particularly with the fact that there are very often historical religions that have been seen as superior, we think that all this does is ensure that it is far more difficult to displace those majority narratives, because now minority groups cannot go out and hand out their posters or their flyers. So when the society, which is like historically being Christian, is extremely xenophobic and continues to feel very xenophobic, even if there are no longer Christians handing out flyers, it is very definitely a harm that people cannot go out and interact with like moderate Muslim people because they cannot have a one-to-one, face-to-face interaction. We think that that's very dangerous. They tell us that this isn't the case because what happens here is it's not public validation for dangerous and like extremist things. We think you are far more likely to have validation of something when people feel as if the state has isolated them, they've shared the core beliefs with you, and they've been brought up with those same beliefs. Moreover, we think it's just like a lie to say that extremists aren't allowed into mosques. Like, it would make very little sense, but we also just think that it is, what does that say? We think that terrorists are probably going to find ways to like spread their beliefs in any case. All they do here is reassert a power imbalance that means that how people interact with religion is fundamentally skewed in favor of majorities instead of minorities. Moreover, and importantly, we think that they ignore the dignity of those who have, as part of their religious beliefs, the obligation to go out and spread the messages of those religions. Very often they are messages of love. They're not necessarily messages of hate. Moreover, we think that it's far easier for those messages to reach out to people as opposed to people having to seek them out. When you're at your lowest, you're far less likely to go out and seek out help. But if that help is there and available for you, we think you have a chance to access it. Because of reasons and logic, we are proud to oppose.
Panel, 2 points in my speech. Firstly, we're going to analyze what is unique about the active advocacy of religion within public spaces, why that, given a religious framework, actually means we get less freedom of religion overall for more people. Secondly, we're going to talk about why public advocacy, and engaging with open opposition, why public advocacy is likely to be hijacked by the most extremist elements, and therefore create more extremism and less discourse, which is what that side wants. Before that, note the premise in OO's case is that are twofold. One, that when a person approaches me on the street and tries to preach to me, there is actual in-depth discourse on the nature of religions and the sort of societal conflicts that occur. The second one is that this person handing out the flyer to me is a good representation of the average Muslim I'm likely to see in an office environment. Both of these, we say, are completely false, and I'm going to analyze this in my second point. What else do they tell us? They tell us we're pushing this policy to the private sphere. This was just a play on words. We have no analysis there provided on why you get more policy targeted at people on an individual level. We just can't respond to this because there was no analysis there. They tell us, religion can be good and religion is preserved. Yes, both these things are true, and they are true on both sides of the house, not impacted by this debate. Let's talk about harming other people's freedom of religion. Opening government tell us a few things. They tell us these tend to be confrontational interactions. They tend to outdistance others. They tend to talk about things like hell and so on. Opening opposition say those are unuseful strategies. They're usually nice people and so on. What we're going to say is that you have to acknowledge what specifically a religious person from another a highly religious person from another group undergoes when he's exposed to this sort of advocacy. Because in a religious state of mind, and this is very important to understand, there's very little distinction between thought and action, or actually thought is sometimes significantly more important than action, because what you believe in is what determines things like your salvation, how good of a person you are, what sort of rewards you are likely to receive. Why is this important? Because this means that when someone is trying to actively shake my belief in the core tenets of my own religion and advocate a different religion to me, that is a much larger attack on me as a person than anything he could have said if even he tried to physically assault me. Definitely if he did something like slur and things of this sort, which note are things that would not allow in public space today. But moreover, we're saying that the symbols of other religions are often highly offensive, specifically to people from other religions. Even if for example, in Jewish religion, a cross is actually seen as unholy, is seen as something that is blasphemous. If a person, with all good intentions, shows Dovi, for example, a cross, that is likely for him to be very offensive, to be an attack on who he is, how he experiences the world. And we are saying that sort of attack, even with the best intentions, is illegitimate. But moreover, we're saying that the most likely group to be targeted by advocacy, or one of the groups most likely to be targeted, are children. Why is that the case? Because they're more impressionable, because it's easy to capture them. I see every day in Jerusalem ultra-Orthodox people distributing candy to children, and then making them recite prayers. That is something that why is this important? Because first of all, it means that we're taking away oftentimes parents' rights to educate their children on their beliefs, and we're allowing others to hijack them. But moreover, it means that now religious people do feel less able to walk the street. They feel they're less likely to let their children interact with in public places. That means you actually get communities closing up more. So we're saying, so why is all this important? First of all, because when we, in response to our POI about nudity, opening opposition say that their criteria is things that are likely to be offensive for a lot of people. That is the criteria we fulfill by showing you that a lot of people are likely to see this as highly offensive. But moreover, note that when we're talking about the public space, there are a lot of things that are important identity components that we're willing to limit to a large extent. Note that we highly regulate people's ability to gather in a public space. We limit the amount of noise you can make in a public space. We limit things like nudity, all these things. Why is this important? Because it shows you that that what we prioritize under status quo in public space is neutrality of that public space and the ability for free access to that public space. They're saying that is specifically what's undermined by public advocacy, and therefore we say that alone is a criteria enough in order to ban it. So let's, before I go on to telling why this is hijacked by extremists, closing, please.
All forms of speech aim at trying to include individuals or trying to exclude some individuals. Until this point, no government team has told us what the distinction is, because if so, you would ban speech.
I just made the distinction of why specifically in a religious framework that is a specific, unique identity issue. Why thought it translates to act specifically within that framework. I don't think I need to repeat that. The judges hopefully wrote it down. Let's talk about why this is likely to be hijacked by extremists. Because opening opposition say we're actually allowing people to be exposed to. We need to allow people to be exposed to the discourse within religions themselves. First of all, note that opening government quite clearly say that we are still able to give data and information about that religion. So obviously that part can still happen. But what we're saying is that often those who preach are likely to be the most extremist. Why? For two reasons. Why? One, you need a very strong belief in what you're doing in order to actually dedicate your life to preaching outside and to doing these sort of things. These are unlikely to be people, normative people who have jobs, who have other concerns. These are likely to be the most extremist within that religion. So likely that is what they're spreading as well. Secondly, even if most of them are completely benign, the messages are most likely to hear and most likely to echo are the one person who says doomsday is coming, we should kill the infidels, because that person, note, you don't interact within any other sphere as a moderate person from the other religion. Now he paints what you think of other Muslims. He is the one who paints what you think of other religious minorities. Note that on our side of the house, obviously you interact with people on an individual level. They have jobs, they're in the streets, they can make interreligious dialogue, but these specific people were taking away their ability to hijack religions. About religious parties that opening government discussed, we're saying that here as well, there is obviously a purity race, in the sense that if you're a religious party, your primary system is likely to be dominated by, on the level of how religious you are, you're likely to have religious leadership. On the other hand, when you're integrated into a larger party, there's more incentive for cooperation, for moderation, for cooperating with others within that party, and we're saying you're likely to get the less extremist elements within that represent most people from that religion on our side of the house. For all these reasons, extremely proud to propose them.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this point in the debate, I think we've allowed the government bench to run away with unrealistic, extreme characterizations of everyday people that have religions in the status quo. No, Ayal, people that go on the sidewalk and preach at the side of the street on a weekend are not likely to be the individuals that are extremists and the people that want to tell individuals that they are going to hell and they are going to bomb people at the end of the day. Opening opposition gave you some reason for that. We'll give you 3 more extensions as to why that's so. Firstly, I think I want to undercut the fundamental premise as to whether or not the people that we're talking about are likely to be extreme or not. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, that Mubarak tried to sneakily tell us that extremism is bred primarily in public spaces. And the evidence that he provided was that in London madrasas, a ban in madrasas has been included to ban people who are extreme. Notice that this is an example that is, number one, dubious, and I question the truth of this example, but number two, circumstantial at best, without any sort of analysis whatsoever to prove analytically why this is logically true, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we'll provide you actual analysis as to why this is actually untrue. Because likely, if you're an individual that is extreme and ISIS sympathizer and things like that, you're probably not on the street advertising in the public, ladies and gentlemen, hey guys, I want to bomb people after this, ladies and gentlemen. Those are exactly the same individuals that thrive in private spaces as opposed to public spaces in that particular regard, because that serves their interest in this particular circumstance. That's why most likely the people who are in public spaces that are comfortable enough saying things in public, ladies and gentlemen, sometimes might be the individuals that try to alienate and tell people that, for example, you're going to hell. Opening opposition gives you good reason to believe that that's ineffective and people aren't very affected by that, ladies and gentlemen. But more likely than not, we think we win the characterization as to whether or not these people are actually extreme or not. But secondly, they tell us that majority groups also are going to be people in the public, going to be validating your opinion. And that's why you're going to be more extreme if majoritarian groups are able to see that their religions are validated again and again and again. Notice, ladies and gentlemen, that this oftentimes is uncomparative argument. The reason for that, ladies and gentlemen, is that you're not comparing it to the fact that they're also being validated in private spaces as well. That means the majority groups that you're talking about oftentimes have religious structures and religious leaders that are validating those opinions and communities again and again. If there is an increase, it's marginal at best on this side of the house, and there was no analysis to demonstrate how much more of an increase there was on this side of the house. But what can we prove to you on the converse at least, ladies and gentlemen? That at least individuals that live in echo chambers that on this side of the house, for example, the Muslims and the minorities that are prone to be exposed to extremism in London, or for example France, for example, no longer live in echo chambers because, for example, when they go into public spaces, there's a variety of religions and people that they're exposed to, for example, ladies and gentlemen. And this is incredibly important because now CO impacts this argument, considering that now it dispels all the stereotypes that their very own communities build throughout societies. If you're actually concerned about the minorities that actually build extremist views, there is only built in which they have, for example, private spaces, the imams that you're talking about, have exclusive control over the exposure they have within their private spaces, as opposed to having public exposure to everyone else that's able to have demonstratively a contradictory characterization to those particular characterizations by their religious leaders, ladies and gentlemen. At this point, opening government and closing government haven't demonstrated why it was likely, ladies and gentlemen, not only that it will be the most extreme, but why is it that you're able to break those echo chambers, or why comparatively those extreme natures and extreme structures would disappear on this side of the house if you say they're so prevalent. We think we break that deadlock and win that particular clash. We think we make people more moderate under our side of the house, or expose people to more moderation under our side of the house, ladies and gentlemen. But additionally, and more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, we think it's incredibly important for us to note that if we're really talking about the individuals that are, for example, extreme, right? These are the individuals that are going to either break the law or are able to shape the narrative irrespective of your ban in this particular circumstance. Right? The people who are likely that are going to listen to your ban are the average everyday Muslims that are moderate, nice people that are not going to want to risk and break the law on this side of the house. The reason why this is important is because who gets to dictate the public perception of what Muslims are, what Christians are the very same extremists on this side of the house. They have no regard whatsoever about public norms, laws, and things like that, ladies and gentlemen. The reason why this is exceptionally important because all the public sentiment that you're talking about that leads to discrimination on this side of the house can only be beaten when people who are moderate or people who are liberal, ladies and don't identify extremism can disassociate themselves and dispel those stereotypes publicly on this side of the house. That's how we had campaigns after all the bombings last year, ladies and gentlemen, like not in my prophet's name, not in my name, for example, to dispel the fact that ISIS is that Muslims are associated with ISIS, for example. You don't allow that opportunity for average everyday Muslims to be able to do that and lead into vicious cycle where the majorities that opening opposition talk about lead into all the extremist rhetoric and stereotypes of minorities that the opening government, closing government want to dispel so much in this particular debate. That means that we lead to better treatment of people and better fixing stereotypes under our side house. Yes, ma'am.
Sure, people may not preach ISIS agenda in public, but they still say we are the only right ones in the eyes of God. When it is a norm for people to do that, that's when you harbor hate. How do you change the normal conversations around religion?
Okay, so before I get to that, which is a principal question, I really think that debaters thus far have been very lazy in terms of principle analysis. I'm going to do that later on. But firstly, I want to establish at this point in the debate, none of government's claims in regards to extremism and moderation still stand, considering that they don't provide actual analysis to it. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at the principle as to what is legitimate speech in this particular debate. Notice, I asked this POI twice, right? And Ayala actually didn't give us any distinction whatsoever. Because really, race can be militarized, personal philosophy can be militarized, and not everyone, ladies and gentlemen, takes religion exceptionally seriously till they are confronted to an exceptional extent as the government say. In public spaces, you can walk away. The harm that you're talking about on the government bench also is speculative and subjective based on who you're talking about, in what circumstance, what side of the debate you woke up on in that particular morning, ladies and gentlemen. The presumption that occurred on the government bench is that every instance of religious expression is alienating, vitriolic, and toxic, when most of the time the characterization is the exact opposite in the status quo, ladies and gentlemen, and that's exactly why it's harmful. That means the trade-off you have to make in a banned debate is that you're trading off everyone's right to be able to express your religion, which is no less legitimate in comparison to all other speech that alienates, whether it be beauty, whether it be race, whether it be all other personal characteristics, ladies and gentlemen, because a subset of you that doesn't represent the whole. That's why on a matter of principle, ladies and gentlemen, they also lose a bit. I'm exceptionally proud to oppose.
How should we view this debate? Note, huddle, the key word is public. A marvelous case by the opening government. Religion is exclusive. It might be confrontational, specifically this kind of interaction. It might alienate people. Here is the response that we get from the opening opposition. Everything is still going to exist. We are not resetting the world to the beginning of time. You're still going to have people who are currently in domination of the public sphere from parties. We are still going to have politics. People are still going to be religious, and we are not likely to eradicate it. Here is what we actually have in order to fill it up. Firstly, we do a balance of rights. We talk in principle why specifically in public, irregardless of whether people are going to be less or more radical, this is something that should be banned on principle, unlike other forms of speech. Secondly, we talk specifically about radicals and why they're likely to be significantly more worse. These are going to be the themes, the principle and the balance of rights. Firstly, note, currently, and this is the infrastructure that we provide in how to perceive the burdens in this debate, the obstruction of public life within the public sphere is enough in order to ban things within public. Noise is something that we ban. Nudity is something that we ban solely on the criteria that this is something that obstructs the life of other people. Why does that matter? Because it flips the burden in this debate. What do we mean by that? Because under the status quo, we strive in most countries that the public sphere should be neutral. Therefore, the burden is on them to show us that this is a unique kind of speech and not on us to separate it. So this is already something that we provide on an analysis here. But secondly, look, we are also willing to limit what we do to religions and what they can do, like polygamy in many cases, if it carries a harm. Therefore, we might do it. The question that we ask ourselves is, what is the balance? So let's do it here. And note, I'm going to just say before entering that myth doesn't actually answer all for extension. It's a shame that we won't have a chance to respond to it. What do you mean by that? Firstly, look, what is unique about religion? Here is something which is special about it. In many cases, if I'm throwing fully a believer. I believe that God can have access to my thoughts. Part of my purity is how I view the world and perceive it. The mere fact that currently I'm going to be forced to say that maybe my religion should be shaken, that I'm going to see the confrontational messages, that I'm going to be able to think that I should be undermined, is something which is a deep interaction. Note, the mere fact, even if I'm not going to be shaken, but I'm going to be forced to confront, but I'm going to be forced to engage in discussion, is a deep upsetting towards my identity. We are willing to, and they say, oh, but you can just walk away. This is something which applies to every kind of harassment that I'm undergoing, right? You can walk away from sexual harassment. This is something that we should simply do not accept as a criteria here. If under the status quo, I am forced to define myself on an irrelevant criteria, within a place that the criteria has nothing to do with, like the neutral public space, we are unwilling to let individuals undergo this interaction, exactly like women in the workplace should not be identified by sexuality. People who are currently have a religious belief should not be shut out based on that. Look, we talk about that even more. It has a unique impact about small children who are targeted by that. It has a uniquely coercive effect in terms of the impact here. Like we're unwilling to allow cults in the vast majority of cases, we are not going to be willing to target people who cannot actually engage in a meaningful discussion, and there is a clear incentive to approach specifically them. Look in terms of impact, what does this do in this debate? Because even regardless of radicals, even regardless of what is going to happen at the end of the day, the mere fact that some people are going to be told by the rabbi that they shouldn't cross a specific street, or that they cannot engage with a discussion, or that they cannot go out in public, is enough to be a huge harm to many communities, and therefore it's a clear separation between us and the opening government already, which unfortunately CEO doesn't answer at all. Moreover, look, they say, or specifically, oh, but we're taking away the capacity to express my own religion. No, we don't, because you're still going to have access to your community, and you're still going to be able to go to church, and you're still going to be able to do all of these things. So therefore, we don't take something meaningful to you. So on a balance of rights, for someone who is now being pushed and coerced to be confronted, or might have the incentives to target specifically the young, we are taking away something fundamental as there's freedom of religion on a grand scale. But for people who are currently want to have the expression in a specific religion, they can still engage in all of that. So therefore, on a mass scale principle level, we provide much more freedom of religion under our side of the house. But now to radicals. Let's answer what we get from CEO specifically here. Look, here is the issue with both oppositions in terms of what they miss. They never actually show us meaningful discussions. Let's say that I'm extremist, like Mif tells us. Let's say that I'm kind of one of the Jews that believe that we should bomb Mecca. Let's say that I'm going to now interact with someone on the street. Am I actually likely? Do we get any analysis on why I'm likely to change my opinions? Unfortunately, everything that the gentleman goes to add there is going to be new. But moreover, look, they make a false dichotomy. The fact that I'm extremist doesn't mean they're going to tell people to bomb other places. In many cases, I can still be very much extremist and only advocate against gay people and only advocate against people who are other minorities and only try to confront others. Extremist doesn't equate automatically wanting to bomb others. But look also what they miss here. Because what we provide you is, even if they are correct, is the analysis to why there are incentives to be more extreme. So let's even say that if this is correct, and only the extremists are going to remain, which I'm going to tackle in a second, for much more people who are going to be even significantly more extreme openly.
The examples that you predicate your principle on of a neutral space are not fundamental to the identity or dignity of individuals. That sort of trade-off implies that it is a greater attack on dignity for a woman.
We simply don't understand A because you can preserve the other side, and simply no, we simply disagree. I might want to be nude in public as part of my identity in many cases. Maybe I want to do it right now. It's still something that we do disallow in many cases. We simply don't accept the patronizing that we get from your side. Look, firstly, look. They say only the extreme are going to be remaining. Here is something which is crucial here. Now we can lock them up because we're going to have the tools. Now we can find them. Now we can shut them out. Now less people, even people who are less extreme, are going to be pushed by the incentive structure to be more. Note that they do not engage with us. The fact is, people who are actually much more extreme are going to be more likely to prioritize it over their work. The fact that they have to confront with other people within the discourse because there are many ways to try to get attentions from others. Therefore, this shows you the incentive to try and be as much radicalized as possible. They need to capture the attention. The fact that these are the people who are more likely to shape others' opinions. So even if less people are going to be part of the public discourse, if I'm the only one who is remaining, so if most people who are there have the incentive to shut out hell and heaven and bombing, as they say, and the capacity to say that gays should be not part of public life, this is what shapes the majority of the people's opinion over a specific religion. They'll show you a mass harm on how it conditions how others in society have the perceptions of that, which shows you that extremism is only fueled by that. Look, even if we don't meet this burden, the fact that it's shaken by identity and confrontation and coercion is enough on a principal level. But even so, extremism is much more likely if we do not pass this policy. We beg you to propose.
I think up till this point, side government has presumed that just because religious rhetorics can be weaponized and sometimes it can be harmful, means that limiting that discussion will make true advocacy will make that any less harmful. I have two themes in this whip speech. Number one, how moderation of the interpretations of religion is more likely under our side, and then secondly, how we deal with extremism and so on. So number one, moderation. So OG said, without public advocacy, moderation is more likely because people are more likely to scrutinize themselves and moderate their own religious beliefs. I don't think this is true, because I don't think every individual or most individual will always interrogate their religious beliefs. Why? Because fundamentalism is a lot more intuitive. It's probably within the literal interpretation of a lot of religious texts. It's more likely to be the predominant belief that most people subscribe to. That means that in order for you to get more people to scrutinize and introspect their religion and to make them more moderate, you need advocacy to some extent. But why is it that moderation is more likely through advocacy? Because the presence of religion, particularly fundamentalism, is present in most places that they already have access to. That means that while you can find a lot of moderate madrasas in central London or in New York, that's really not the case for the most parts of the world. That means that fundamentalism already have access to all of the madrasas, all of the churches they already have under status quo. So they have the ability to continuously entrench fundamentalism and perpetuate into extremism as well. That means that the moderation, which is the challenge to that fundamentalism, usually don't have a madrasas of their own or don't have many madrasas to be able to impact people on a daily basis. That means that moderation most of the time happens exclusively through advocacy in order for them to challenge the existing fundamentalism. So we think the breeding of the discussion of moderation happens under our side. And we don't need all discussion that happens on the side of the road to be extremely in-depth for this benefit to accrue. That means that you only need a person sending a leaflet to you for you to think about whether or not wearing the hijab is consistent with Islam or not, and all the other questions that you have. That means that having people who are moderate in the public space where they otherwise wouldn't have access to means that they allow more people to introspect and allow more people to think about moderating their religion. That doesn't only also happen to people interested in that religion, but also people who are not part of that religion, whether they view that religion as moderate or not, whether or not they think that those religions particularly lenient, or whether there are many various interpretations of that religion. We think that exclusively happens through public advocacy. We think that's also very important, particularly for minority religions, because mainstream religions presumably have some degree of discussion already going on given the amount of people that subscribe to that religion. But minority religions are more beholden to fundamentalism than not. That's because there are very little discussions going around about that particular religion. Very little people discuss that in articles, very little people talk about it. That's why public advocacy, when it comes to the moderation of that minority religion, is also very important, as well as to correct any misunderstandings about any extremist or minority religion. Because the converse or the comparative is not that people immediately assume the best of religion without public advocacy. Because most of the time,
time, what people will presume is who are the loudest within that religion. It doesn't require a ban for extremists to want to spread the things that they say. Because if Mubarak can come up here and say the Salafis have gone around sending secret leaflets with secret links, they can still do that with a ban, and they're more likely to do that because they don't care about how that bans impact their religion, because they have already been banned from madrasas, they're still doing this. So it's likely that those people will shape the way in which we view religion, unfortunately, and push more people to the extreme. We don't think that's a good thing. The impact of this is only under closing government that you change religious discussion and make them more moderate and less potent and less ability for people to use religion to be weaponized against other individuals. We think that's exclusive, because if you are able to change the discussion about religion to make them more moderate, then it's less likely that people will feel hurt by the oppression in which some people say religions are. That means if some people think that Islam is hurtful, but if the presence of a lot of moderate advocates will mean that people feel that it's less likely to weaponize Muslims, because they believe that there are many different interpretations of Muslims. It's a lot more moderate in that sense. Let's move on to closing government. According to closing government, what advocacy look like is adults distributing candies to children. We think that's a problem in itself and not exclusive to religious advocacy, right? But let's talk about the meat of their case, was that most religions do believe that they are the one true religion and are exclusive. We don't think that's news. A lot of people do know that religion is exclusive, and they do believe that they are the one true religion. What's the difference here? We think public advocacy allows people to understand that despite people thinking that they're exclusive and that they are the one true religion, that they also are capable of spreading messages of love and talking about many different issues within their religion, right? We think that changes under our side makes people believe that religion is not only exclusive, but people do believe that there are other issues and that they are also quite inclusive, and they are interested in interacting and talking to you despite them believing that they are the one true religion and so on. We think it's very important. Before that opening,
Your moderation is contingent on public discourse, but why is moderation likely when religious-based politics disallows you from questioning religion and leaders? Instead, they cling on to power using religion?
No, that's status quo. Under status quo, people already, some religions are already a majority. A lot of people already fundamentally believe in the truth of some of those religions. And all these religions who are fundamental, they all already have access to public spaces where they can continue this fundamentalism. So we need public advocacy in order to change that discourse and moderate that discourse, which is only possible under our side, right? So at the end of this debate, we think from side closing government, we exclusively prove to you how we can moderate interpretations of religion, why otherwise moderates don't have access to public spaces, the madrasas, and pushing the discussion to private discussions make religious discussion a lot worse. We think that the neutrality of religion that closing government want to say is only completely possible they ban religious symbols and allow people to never be offended by anything religious. We think the normalization of conversation of religion is a lot more important, and we're very happy to support that from closing opposition. Proud to oppose.